The sun was beginning to sink behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the edge of the forest. A young woman stumbled along the worn dirt path, each step heavier than the last. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, her body weakened, not only by fatigue, but by the illness that had plagued her for weeks. She clutched her thin shawl around her shoulders, shivering in the cool evening air. The town she had fled from, a place that had once promised safety and familiarity, had become a cage of judgment and cruelty. She had no friends to call upon, no family to care for her, only the constant gnawing realization that if she did not find help soon, she might not survive the night. As she collapsed to her knees near the forest's edge, the sharp scent of pine and earth filled her senses. Her vision blurred, the world swaying around her as her body fought against the weakness that threatened to claim her. A soft rustle among the trees startled her, and she froze, fear and desperation intertwining in a tight knot in her chest. Out of the shadows emerged a figure tall and imposing, yet moving with a quiet, deliberate grace. He was an Apache warrior, a man who had chosen a life of solitude in the forest, away from the towns and settlements that had brought him nothing but pain. His long black hair, tied back to keep it out of his face, moved slightly in the evening breeze, and his eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the area before settling on the trembling woman. He was not expecting to find anyone here, and certainly not a fragile human in such dire condition. Yet something about her vulnerability stirred an instinct in him that he had long tried to suppress, the need to protect, to care, to intervene when another life teetered on the edge of death. For a moment, neither spoke. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, unsure if this stranger meant harm. His stance was calm but firm, radiating a strength that made her heart pound with a mix of terror and a strange sense of safety. He took a cautious step forward, extending a hand, his voice low but steady. "You are hurt. Come with me," he said. Though the words were simple, they carried an authority that brooked no argument. She hesitated, her mind racing between the warnings of past dangers and the undeniable need for help. Her body, too weak to resist, made the choice for her, and she allowed him to lift her with surprising gentleness. The walk to his hidden cabin was slow, measured as he supported her fragile frame. The forest seemed to close around them, the dense trees and underbrush forming a natural shield from the outside world. Birds settled in the branches above, and the wind whispered through the leaves, as if acknowledging the unusual intrusion into this quiet domain. He was silent for most of the journey, focused on ensuring she remained stable, though his mind raced with questions about who she was and why fate had brought her to his sanctuary. When they finally arrived, the cabin appeared almost magically, tucked among the trees as if it had grown from the earth itself. Smoke curled gently from a stone chimney, and the soft glow of a fire inside hinted at warmth and safety. He settled her onto a rough-hewn bed, pulling blankets around her thin frame. She finally allowed herself to breathe, the tension in her body slowly melting as exhaustion overtook her fear. He watched her carefully, noting the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the pallor of her skin, the faint tremors in her hands. Though he had lived a life shaped by solitude and hardship, he could not ignore the fragility of life when confronted so directly. The presence of this woman, stricken and vulnerable, began to awaken something long dormant within him. Empathy, concern, and a sense of responsibility that went beyond his own survival. In that first encounter, an unspoken connection formed, a fragile bridge between two lives previously shaped by hardship and isolation. Neither spoke much that night, but the foundation of trust and curiosity had been laid. In saving her from the brink of death, he unknowingly opened the door to a transformation that would forever change the course of both their lives. The cabin stood hidden deep in the forest, a small, sturdy structure made of weathered logs that blended seamlessly with the surrounding wilderness. It was a place untouched by the chaos of the outside world, a sanctuary of silence, smoke, and the quiet rhythm of nature. For the Apache warrior, it had been more than a home. It was a refuge, a fortress built not only to shield him from outsiders, but also to preserve the fragile peace he had carved from a life of loss and solitude. Every log, every stone, every detail reflected the careful consideration of a man who valued self-reliance and harmony with the land above all else. He guided her through the cabin with steady hands, helping her to sit by the warm glow of a small fire that crackled and hissed, filling the space with comforting warmth. The aroma of burning pine mingled with the earthy scent of the cabin, grounding her in the present moment and soothing the raw edges of her fear. She observed the interior carefully, a simple bed with thick blankets, a small table holding jars of herbs and dried roots, shelves lined with handcrafted tools, and a few personal items that hinted at the life of the man who lived here in solitude. It was far from luxurious, but it radiated care, order, and quiet dignity. As she sank onto the bed, feeling the weight of her illness pressing against her, he moved with practiced efficiency, arranging blankets around her frail body and checking her pulse and breathing. His hands, calloused yet gentle, betrayed a familiarity with both hardship and healing. There was no rush, no unnecessary words, just deliberate, purposeful actions that conveyed competence and concern. He brewed a small pot of herbal tea, the steam curling upward as he placed it carefully within her reach. She took it tentatively, the warmth of the liquid soothing her parched throat and the bitterness grounding her in a moment of rare comfort. The cabin itself seemed to mirror the warrior's character, solid, reliable, and attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. Outside, the forest whispered in the wind, birds returned to roost and shadows lengthened across the clearing. But inside, a different kind of life persisted. Time moved slowly here, measured by the cycles of the sun and the fire, rather than the incessant demands of society. For her, who had lived under constant pressure and scrutiny, this stillness was at once disorienting and intoxicating. She felt as if she had been thrust into another world, a place where the rules she had always known no longer applied, and, for the first time in weeks, she could allow herself to simply exist. Despite the warmth and care, tension lingered in the air. The woman was wary of the man who had rescued her, her body tense with a mixture of fear and instinct. She had learned through bitter experience that strangers often brought harm, even under the guise of help. The warrior, for his part, was cautious as well. Solitude had been his armor for so long that any intrusion into his carefully maintained world was met with a quiet vigilance. Yet there was an unspoken understanding forming between them, a recognition that their current circumstances required trust, even if it had to be earned slowly and delicately. As the evening progressed, the warrior moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, tending to small tasks that ensured their shared survival. He gathered firewood, refilled the water container from a nearby stream, and checked his supplies of herbs, all the while casting occasional glances toward her. She watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, noticing the way his movements were precise yet unhurried, the way his eyes scanned the cabin and the forest beyond with equal attention. In those moments, she began to sense that this man, though enigmatic and solitary, might hold the key to her survival. That night, as darkness settled over the forest and the fire's glow painted the cabin walls with dancing shadows, the woman finally allowed herself to close her eyes, surrendering to the exhaustion that had driven her to the brink. The warrior sat nearby, silent, alert, and protective, a sentinel against both the wilderness and the uncertainties of fate. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the whispers of the forest and the steady pulse of the fire, the first threads of a fragile trust began to weave themselves between two souls who had, until this moment, known only hardship and solitude. Here, in the hidden cabin, life began its slow, careful work, mending wounds, forging trust, and opening the door to a connection that neither of them could have anticipated, yet both would come to rely upon in ways that would transform their worlds forever. The days following her arrival at the cabin passed in quiet rhythm, each one marked by the slow, deliberate work of healing. The Apache warrior moved around her with the certainty of someone who had spent years attuning himself to the natural world, understanding not only the terrain, but the delicate balance of life within it. He prepared simple meals, carefully selecting herbs and roots from his stores in the surrounding forest, explaining little but showing everything through action. She watched him, fascinated by the way he seemed to know instinctively which plants could soothe pain, which leaves could cool a fever, which roots could strengthen the body. At first, she was reluctant to eat or drink, still haunted by the fear that she might be a burden or that her presence was unwelcome. But the warrior's quiet patience was unyielding. He never forced her, never raised his voice. He simply provided, and in that consistency, she found herself trusting him more than she had trusted anyone in years. Slowly she began to accept his care, sipping the bitter herbal teas, swallowing the thick broths, letting warmth and nourishment return to her body. Each meal, each careful touch was a small step back toward life, a life that had seemed to slip away from her in the cold, uncaring town she had left behind. As her body began to strengthen, the warrior began to allow conversation to enter the cabin. It was tentative at first, small exchanges about the simplest things, the weather, the forest, the fire. But gradually more personal truth slipped between them. He spoke of his life in the wilderness, the pain of losing family to disease and violence, the betrayal by those he had once trusted. His voice, calm yet tinged with sorrow, revealed the depths of a man shaped by solitude and survival. She in turn shared her own story, not of the illness that threatened her life, but of the loneliness, the scorn, the fear that had chased her from the only home she had ever known. Through this sharing, a fragile bridge formed between them. Trust, which had seemed impossible when she first collapsed at the forest's edge, began to grow. She found herself laughing softly at moments she did not expect, marveling at his quiet wisdom, and even teasing him gently about his meticulous care of the cabin and his herbs. He, who had lived years without anyone to ease his burdens, began to feel a warmth he had thought long dead. The realization that connection was possible, that someone could enter his secluded world not as an intruder, but as a companion. Their healing, however, was not only physical or emotional, it was also a matter of presence. The warrior's care was steady and unflinching, and she learned to move through the cabin and surrounding forest with his guidance, building strength in her limbs, confidence in her steps, and clarity in her mind. They gathered firewood together, walked along hidden trails, and observed the subtle changes of the forest around them. The rhythm of nature became a teacher, the patience of the seasons, the persistence of life in every leaf and stream, mirrored their slow recovery and deepening bond. At night, when the fire crackled and the forest whispered outside, they would sit in companionable silence. Sometimes he would strum a small handmade instrument, its simple tones filling the cabin with warmth. She would listen, feeling the tension of weeks of suffering begin to release. Each day, each shared moment, was a quiet rebellion against the illness that had brought her to his doorstep. Together, they were rewriting the story of her body, her heart, and his own carefully guarded soul. Through these acts, tending wounds, sharing meals, exchanging stories, walking through the forest, the woman began to reclaim the life she had thought lost. The warrior, too, was transformed. His once solitary existence now held the stirrings of companionship, responsibility, and the quiet thrill of emotional awakening. They were two people deeply scarred, learning that life could still offer hope, comfort, and the beginnings of love, even in the most unlikely of places. By the end of the third week, her fever had broken, her strength returned, and her eyes, once dull with illness, shone with vitality. The cabin, once merely a shelter, had become a crucible of transformation, a place where the sick found health, the lonely found trust, and two disparate lives began the slow, deliberate weaving of a shared destiny. As the days melted into weeks, the young woman and the Apache warrior found themselves moving in a rhythm that needed no words. Life in the hidden cabin was a quiet choreography. She would rise with the first light filtering through the trees, and he would already be tending the fire, preparing the day's tasks with careful precision. She watched him, learning the subtle movements, the unspoken decisions that guided his life, and gradually, she began to mirror them in small ways, gathering herbs, sweeping the cabin floor, assisting in preparing meals. Each act, though simple, was a thread in the growing tapestry of their connection. The warrior, who had long been a solitary figure, began to recognize the comfort of her presence. He did not need to speak to feel it. Her laughter as she worked, the quiet humming as she moved about the cabin, the occasional glance she would give when he thought she was distracted, all these small signals slowly unraveled the armor he had built around himself. He found himself anticipating her needs, making subtle adjustments in the cabin to ease her comfort, placing herbs where they would be easiest for her to reach, adjusting blankets on the bed without asking. The awareness that she trusted him so completely, that she depended on his guidance, awakened emotions he had long thought dormant. Care, protectiveness, even a nascent affection. For the woman, the transformation was equally profound. She had come to the forest in fear and desperation, her body weakened by illness, her spirit eroded by isolation and cruelty. Yet here, in the quiet of the cabin and the embrace of the forest, she began to feel a strength she had never known. The warrior's presence was a stabilizing force, a constant in a world that had long offered only unpredictability. She noticed the subtle ways he observed her, how his eyes would linger a moment longer when she moved about the cabin, how he would adjust the fire or shift the blankets without speaking, as if he were attuned not just to her physical needs but to her spirit. Slowly, her fear began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative trust and an unspoken recognition that she was no longer alone. Their bond grew strongest in the moments of silence. When words seemed unnecessary, they would sit together outside the cabin, the sun filtering through the leaves, listening to the wind rustle the branches above. Occasionally, he would strum a simple tune on a handmade instrument, and she would hum along softly, feeling the sound vibrate through her chest, a gentle reminder that life was still present, still capable of beauty. They did not discuss love or fear, past or future. These things seemed irrelevant in the shared quiet of the forest. Instead, they communicated through gestures, glances, and the shared effort of surviving and thriving in their secluded world. The forest itself seemed to respond to their bond. Birds returned to the clearing, streams glimmered more brightly, and even the animals, once wary of the warrior's presence, moved closer with tentative curiosity. Nature became both witness and participant in the formation of this unspoken connection, reflecting their growing trust and the subtle awakening of emotions neither fully understood. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and shadows stretched across the cabin, the woman hesitated before speaking. I think I feel safe here," she whispered, almost afraid to voice the truth. The warrior did not reply immediately. Instead, he adjusted the blankets around her shoulders, his touch gentle, and nodded. That simple gesture spoke volumes, an acknowledgement, a promise, and a recognition of a bond that had grown stronger than either of them could have anticipated. In the hidden cabin, removed from the judgments and cruelties of the outside world, the unspoken bond between them became a foundation for healing, understanding, and transformation. What had begun as a chance encounter, a desperate woman rescued by a solitary warrior, was now evolving into something deeper, something neither had sought, but both had needed. It was a connection built not on words or declarations, but on shared presence, trust in the slow unfolding of two lives intertwined by circumstance, choice, and the quiet magic of the forest. By the end of this period, their bond had become an unshakable current beneath the surface of daily life, silent, powerful, and undeniable. It was a bond that would carry them through trials to come, a tether connecting two souls that had long been alone, yet were now awakening to the possibility of a shared world. Life in the hidden cabin had settled into a fragile rhythm, each day marked by quiet routines and the gentle deepening of the bond between the woman and the Apache warrior. Yet even the most secluded sanctuary is not impervious to the world beyond the forest. One morning, while the warrior was returning from checking traps along the river, he noticed subtle signs that something was amiss. A broken branch, footprints unfamiliar to him, and the faint scent of smoke carried on the wind, not from his own fire, but from beyond the trees. The warrior's instincts, honed over years of survival and vigilance, immediately went on high alert. The forest, usually a place of calm and familiarity, now seemed charged with tension. He scanned the horizon and observed a small group moving cautiously along the edge of the clearing, their eyes scanning the dense foliage. They were townspeople, perhaps a posse sent to find the woman who had disappeared, or worse, individuals motivated by greed or suspicion. The thought of outsiders discovering his sanctuary, the woman, and himself stirred a mix of anger, fear, and protectiveness within him. Returning quickly to the cabin, he found the woman tending the fire, unaware of the approaching threat. He didn't alarm her immediately, knowing that panic could be as dangerous as any weapon. Instead, he began to prepare the cabin and their surroundings, moving with silent efficiency. He checked the windows, reinforced the doors, and collected his bow and arrows, all while explaining in measured words that a group was nearby. The woman's eyes widened at the reality of danger. The forest, which had been a haven, now felt like a precarious cage. "What do they want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "They seek you," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "Some for concern, some for other reasons. We cannot be certain." His eyes met hers, steady and resolute. "We must be ready." The coming hours were filled with preparation and tension. The warrior taught her how to move silently through the cabin, how to remain unseen, how to observe the forest for signs of movement. He did not speak down to her. Instead, he treated her as a partner, recognizing her growing strength and awareness. She, though initially frightened, responded with courage, surprising even herself by assisting in defensive measures and learning the nuances of tracking and observation. As evening fell, the group emerged at the periphery of the forest. Their presence was deliberate, their search methodical, but the warrior had already laid plans to conceal the cabin and protect the woman. From behind the thick trunks of ancient trees, he watched their approach, silently weighing his options. Confrontation was possible, but dangerous. Deception and stealth could preserve the sanctuary without unnecessary violence. The woman, sensing his focus and calm, felt her own fear tempered by trust. She realized that the man who had saved her, nurtured her, and shared this secluded world with her, was willing to risk everything to protect her. The realization sparked a quiet admiration and deepened the bond that had been forming since her first arrival. As the group drew closer, the warrior's mind raced through possible scenarios. He considered their motives: concern, curiosity, greed, or worse. Each possibility required a different response, yet his decisions had to be swift and precise. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig magnified in the tense silence. The woman, once passive and frail, now stood beside him, prepared to act under his guidance. Though she was not a fighter, her resolve and presence strengthened his own focus. Together they became a unit, a pair bound not only by survival, but by a growing emotional connection that neither dared to name aloud. This intrusion from the outside world was the first real test of their fragile sanctuary, a moment where the safety of the cabin, the forest, and their emerging relationship would be measured against the unpredictable forces of humanity. It was a stark reminder that even in solitude life carried risks, and that the bond between them, born of circumstance, nurtured in silence, would be tested in ways they had not yet imagined. By the end of this part, the tension in the forest was palpable, signaling that the tranquility of the hidden cabin was no longer guaranteed, and that the warrior and the woman would have to confront challenges together, both from nature and from the outside world. The night after the intrusion, the forest seemed unusually quiet. Even the usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves was subdued, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The Apache warrior sat by the fire, sharpening his tools in the dim glow, while the woman huddled under a blanket nearby. The tension from the day's events lingered between them, heavier than any words could convey. For the first time since her arrival, they were not moving through routines of survival or healing. They were facing the fragile, delicate reality of their emotional lives. The warrior finally spoke, his voice low, measured, carrying both authority and an unexpected vulnerability. "You were brave today," he said, not as a compliment alone, but as an acknowledgement of her resilience. "Most would have hidden in fear. You did not." She looked at him, startled. She had seen strength in him before, yes, but this recognition, this awareness of her own courage, stirred something inside her that she had long buried. Her lips trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of unspoken emotions. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I might die, and I don't want to leave. Not here, not like this." His eyes softened, and for a moment he allowed himself to reveal a side he had rarely shown. "I'd have feared the same," he said. "I have lived alone for many years thinking I could handle the world by myself. But with you, I see things differently. I fear losing you, not only to the illness but to the world outside this forest." The admission hung in the air like smoke curling from the fire. It was a rare breach in the armor they had both built over years of solitude and suffering. She moved closer, drawn by the honesty in his tone, and allowed herself to express the truth she had been keeping buried. "I've never trusted anyone," she confessed. "People, townspeople, family, they have hurt me in ways I can't explain. I didn't think I could survive without being alone, but here, with you, I feel safe more than I have in a long time." The warrior's hand hovered near hers, then slowly, deliberately, he reached out. Their fingers met above the firelight, tentative yet electric, a tangible connection bridging the chasm of fear and past pain that had separated them. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it spoke of trust, courage, and a willingness to be vulnerable, emotions that had both terrified and eluded them until now. Their shared vulnerabilities were not limited to words or touch. Over the next days, they began to reveal small truths through actions. She helped him repair tools. He allowed her to tend certain parts of the cabin. He shared details of the forest and his survival strategies. She shared fragments of her past life, each memory carefully selected yet raw in its honesty. Every disclosure, every act of openness drew them closer, weaving a subtle intimacy that went beyond physical proximity. They also shared fears of the outside world, of the illness that had once threatened her life, of the isolation that had defined him. These confessions were accompanied by comfort, a hand on a shoulder, a blanket offered without question, a steady presence in silence. In the hidden cabin surrounded by the forest, they created a space where fear could exist without consuming them, where trust could grow without demand, and where emotional honesty became a bridge to a deeper connection. By the end of this period, their bond had evolved into something unspoken yet undeniable, a shared understanding that their survival, both physical and emotional, depended not only on their individual strength but on the courage to expose their vulnerabilities to each other. In doing so, they began to transform fear into trust, isolation into companionship, and uncertainty into a tentative hope for the future. In the quiet of the cabin, with the forest as witness, they discovered that opening their hearts, despite the risks, could bring a strength neither had known alone. The shared vulnerabilities became the foundation for a love and trust that would sustain them through trials yet to come, strengthening the connection that fate had begun in the forest's shadowed edge. The peace of the cabin could not hold forever. As the forest entered the gray chill of early morning, the Apache warrior awoke to the faint sound of voices carried on the wind, low, cautious, and much too close. His instincts sharpened instantly. The group of outsiders who had been searching for the woman had not given up. They had returned, and this time they were determined to find what the forest had been hiding. He rose quietly, his movements swift and silent. The woman stirred, sensing the tension that filled the cabin. "They're back?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded once, eyes narrowing toward the window. "Yes, stay low. Don't move until I say." The warrior reached for his bow, checking his arrows with the precision of a man who knew the cost of hesitation. The forest outside, usually his ally, now seemed fragile, every branch, every leaf a potential betrayer. He could hear the men approaching, stepping clumsily through the underbrush, their boots crunching twigs, their voices gruff and impatient. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, yet she couldn't bear the thought of him facing danger alone. The bond they had forged, through trust, through silence, through shared pain, demanded courage from both of them. "Let me help," she whispered fiercely. "I can distract them if they come too close." He turned sharply, his expression caught between admiration and fear. "No, you will stay safe. That is how you help me." But she saw the truth in his eyes. He was not unshakable, not invincible. He was a man, mortal, standing between her and danger because his heart had already chosen to protect her at all costs. And she realized then that courage was not just about strength. It was about choosing to stand beside someone even when fear consumed you. The intruders reached the edge of the clearing. The warrior stepped silently into the shadows of the trees, blending into the forest as if he were part of it. The woman watched from the cabin's narrow window, every muscle taut. She could see their faces now, 3 men, rugged and impatient, carrying rifles and torches. One of them spoke in a harsh tone. "She must have come this way. There's tracks, see? Smaller footprints. Someone's hiding her." The warrior moved like a ghost through the trees. Every sound, every movement was measured. He knocked an arrow, drawing it taut but not releasing. His intent was not to kill, only to protect, to warn. A rustle from behind one of the trees caught the intruder's attention. One man turned, and before he could speak, an arrow thudded into the ground inches from his boot. Startled, he stumbled back. "She's not yours to find," came the warrior's voice from the shadows, low and commanding. "Leave this place." The men hesitated. They could not see him, only the forest that seemed alive around them. One raised his rifle, but before he could aim, another arrow flew, striking the barrel and sending it clattering from his hands. The message was clear. Inside the cabin, the woman's fear turned to awe. She realized then that the man who had once lived only for solitude was now risking everything for her. But before she could fully process it, one of the intruders broke away from the group, circling toward the cabin. Acting on instinct, she grabbed the nearest object, a pot of boiling water, and stood behind the door. When the man burst inside, shouting, she threw it with trembling hands. He cried out, startled and scalded, stumbling backward. She ran forward, slamming the door shut and bolting it. Her entire body shook, but she had acted, not as a victim but as someone defending her life and her home. Outside, the warrior's voice rang out once more, fierce and resolute. "You've had your warning. Go." The men, unnerved and now injured, retreated, muttering threats as they disappeared into the forest. Silence returned slowly, broken only by the pounding of two hearts within the cabin. When the warrior finally stepped back inside, he found her standing by the door, trembling but defiant. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then, in a rare display of tenderness, he placed a hand on her cheek. "You were brave," he said quietly. "Together, we endured." That night the forest returned to stillness, but neither of them would forget what had happened. The test of courage had shown them both what their connection truly meant, not just survival, but a willingness to stand and fight for one another. Their bond, once unspoken, now carried the weight of shared danger, solidifying into something far deeper than either had imagined. The days that followed the confrontation in the forest brought a strange calm, a silence not of fear, but of deep reflection. The woman and the Apache warrior had both crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had faced death together and chosen to live. The forest around them felt changed too, softer somehow, as if acknowledging their courage. The leaves whispered differently in the wind, and the cabin, once a hiding place for pain, now carried warmth. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, mingling with the scent of pine and firewood. Inside, the woman sat near the hearth, sewing a torn piece of the warrior's shirt with delicate hands. He watched her quietly, seated across the small table. His gaze was intense but not fierce. It carried the depth of a man seeing more than he understood. "You should rest," he said finally. "You've done enough," she smiled faintly, not looking up. "I rest when my hands are busy. It keeps the fear from finding me again." He nodded, understanding more than her words revealed. "Fear doesn't live here anymore," he said softly. "Not while I breathe." The words hung between them, heavy and beautiful. For the first time, she didn't look away. "And what happens," she asked, "when you stop breathing?" The warrior's jaw tightened. He had lost too much already to make promises he could not keep. But this woman, fragile, fierce, unexpected, had already woven herself into his silence, filling the empty spaces he had guarded for years. "Then," he said finally, "the forest will protect you. My spirit will not leave it." Something inside her broke and healed at once. She put the sewing aside and rose slowly. "You speak of forever," she whispered. "And I've never had that. Only hours, days. Borrowed time." He stood too, closing the space between them. "Time doesn't belong to us," he said. "But what we give inside it, that's what makes it ours." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. The cabin creaked softly, the fire casting gold across the walls. He reached for her hand, cautious, reverent, and she didn't pull away. For a long moment, they stood like that, two souls bound by survival, learning what it meant to live for something beyond fear. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "When I first came here, I thought I was dying." He looked down at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You were," he said. "But death is not always the end." She smiled through tears. "No," she whispered. "Sometimes it's the beginning." They talked for hours that evening, about loss, about the world beyond the forest, about his people and their old ways. She listened as he told stories of the stars, of how each spirit became light when it left the earth. He spoke of his mother, a healer who had once told him that love was the strongest medicine, stronger even than herbs or prayer. "Do you believe that?" she asked softly. "I didn't," he admitted. "Not until now." Her heart fluttered at his honesty. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. Not as a patient, not as a burden, but as a woman with strength and purpose. She looked around the cabin. This sacred space carved out of wilderness and will, and realized it had become more than shelter. It was a bridge between who they had been and who they might still become. Later that night, when the storm broke and rain pounded the roof, she found herself standing by the doorway, watching the lightning flash beyond the trees. The warrior joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. They said nothing. The storm raged, but it could not reach them. In that silence, she understood something profound. Healing wasn't always about the body. It was about finding the courage to love again, to believe that one's heart could still open even after being torn apart. The Apache warrior, too, felt the transformation deep within him. The woman's presence had awakened something long buried, a tenderness he had sworn never to feel again. Her laughter, her defiance, even her fragile body defied death itself. He turned to her finally and whispered, "You brought life back to this place." She smiled through the flickering firelight, her eyes glistening. "And you," she said, "brought life back to me." That night the storm passed, leaving the forest washed clean. The cabin stood firm, glowing with the soft light of dawn. Two lives, once marked by endings, now stood at the edge of something new: rebirth, hope, and the fragile, miraculous promise of love. Morning came with a tender hush after the storm. The forest gleamed as if reborn, dew dripping from pine needles, the air rich with the scent of wet earth. Inside the cabin, the Apache warrior stirred from light sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, painting a faint red glow across the woman's peaceful face. He watched her for a long moment, his heart heavy with both peace and fear. She had grown stronger in body, yes, but her sickness lingered like a shadow refusing to let go. Some nights he could hear her quiet coughs, see the pale strain under her smile. The forest had given her time, not a cure. Still, in those quiet hours before dawn, he dared to hope. When she awoke, she found him outside, standing near the creek, his shirt off, his skin gleaming with the early light. He was gathering herbs, grinding roots against stone. She wrapped herself in a blanket and stepped onto the damp porch, her breath catching at the sight. "You still think you can heal me?" she asked gently, her voice teasing but laced with gratitude. He didn't turn at first. "No," he said, continuing to grind the herbs. "But I can try to help you stay." She smiled sadly. "You've already done that. You've helped me remember what it feels like to live." He turned then, eyes solemn. "And to love?" The question lingered in the air like incense. She looked away, her heart aching. "Yes," she whispered. "And that's what scares me." He stepped closer, the morning light haloing his long black hair. "Why?" "Because love makes me want to stay," she said, voice trembling. "And I don't know if I can." He reached out, touching her chin gently, lifting her face until their eyes met. "You don't have to stay forever. Just stay now. Stay today." The simplicity of it broke her heart open. She leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his hand, the strength of his presence quiet the storm inside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't fighting to survive, she was simply living. They spent the morning together by the creek. He taught her how to read the flow of water, how to listen for the forest's song. She laughed when he tried to show her how to weave reeds, her hands clumsy and untrained. He laughed too, deep, unguarded, the sound of a man who had forgotten how to smile. For hours they existed outside of time. The world beyond the forest, the sickness, the pain, the memories felt distant, unreal. But as the sun climbed higher, she grew tired. Her steps slowed, her breath shallowed. He noticed immediately, catching her before she stumbled. "That's enough," he said softly. "Rest," she nodded, letting him carry her back to the cabin. He laid her on the bed and sat beside her, his hand tracing a strand of her hair. "You're stronger than you know," he whispered. She looked up at him, eyes shining. "No," she said faintly. "You make me strong." He smiled then, a rare, tender thing. "Then we're both strong because you brought my soul back from death." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then promise me something," she said, "anything. When I'm gone, you won't bury your heart with me. You'll live. You'll find the light again." His breath caught. He shook his head. "Don't speak of leaving." "I have to," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling. "Because love isn't about holding on, it's about giving. And you've given me peace." He bowed his head, unable to speak. The pain of her words cut deep, but behind it lay a truth he could not deny. He had lost before, but never like this. Not to death, but to love's quiet surrender. When she reached out and touched his cheek, he covered her hand with his own. "Then I promise," he said finally, voice breaking. "If you go, I'll still carry you in every dawn that breaks over these woods." She smiled weakly. That's all I needed. Outside, the light of morning poured through the window, golden and pure. For the first time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together in that fragile silence, two souls bound not by time, but by the promise of love that transcended it. And when the sun finally rose high, painting the forest with warmth, he whispered something in Apache, words she didn't understand but somehow felt. It was a prayer, a vow, a goodbye that wasn't really one. The forest listened. The world held its breath. And love, gentle, fierce, eternal, filled the quiet cabin at dawn. Winter came softly to the forest. Snow fell like feathers from a gray sky, cloaking the world in quiet. The cabin, once a place of healing, now stood wrapped in stillness. The Apache warrior sat beside the fire, its orange glow flickering against his face. The woman lay on the bed, her breathing faint but peaceful. He had known this moment would come. The forest had warned him, each fading heartbeat in the night, each soft cough echoing against the walls. Yet knowing did not make it easier. Every dawn he woke, hoping the world would give her one more day. Every sunset he thanked the spirits that it had. Now the days had grown short. The air inside the cabin was filled with the scent of cedar smoke and the herbs he burned to comfort her. She opened her eyes slowly, finding him sitting near her as he had through every night of her illness. "You should rest," she whispered, her voice like wind through reeds. He shook his head. "Not while you breathe." She smiled faintly, her lips pale but her eyes full of life. "Then you'll never rest at all." He reached out, his calloused hand wrapping around hers. "You taught me peace," he said quietly. "You brought my heart back from the dead. If I rest now, it will be in gratitude, not grief." She turned her face toward the fire, its light dancing across her features. "You were always my safe place," she murmured. "When I found you, I thought I was running from death. But you made me see it differently. I'm not afraid anymore." He bowed his head, unable to speak. A tear slipped down his cheek and fell into her hand. She smiled at the warmth of it. "Promise me again," she whispered, "that you'll live." "I promise," he said, his voice trembling. She nodded, her breath shallow. "Then don't let the world make you hard again. Keep your kindness even when it hurts." "I will." She closed her eyes, her hand tightening once around his before growing still. For a long moment, the cabin seemed to stop breathing with her. The fire crackled softly, a single ember rising and fading in the air. The warrior sat motionless, listening to the silence. The ache that filled his chest was vast and wordless, but beneath it ran something else, peace. She had gone as she had lived these last few months, gently, bravely, surrounded by the wild beauty she had come to love. When the first light of morning touched the trees, he lifted her in his arms and carried her outside. The forest was hushed, the snow pristine. He laid her to rest beneath an old oak near the creek, the same place where she had once laughed at her clumsy hands trying to weave reeds. He sang then. The song was ancient, one his mother had sung for the souls of their people as they returned to the Great Spirit. His voice, low and rough, carried through the pines, echoing against the frozen hills. When it was done, he placed her locket, a small silver trinket she had once worn, on the mound of earth. He whispered in Apache, "Walk with the dawn. I will see you there." Days passed. Then weeks. The snow began to melt. The cabin no longer felt empty, it felt sacred. Her presence lingered in the rhythm of the river, in the whisper of the wind, in the warmth of the sun that touched his face each morning. He kept his promise. He stayed in the forest, tending to the land, helping lost travelers, mending what was broken. The people in the nearby valley began to speak of him again. The quiet Apache who lived among the pines, who healed without medicine, who spoke to the earth as if it understood him. And sometimes, when dawn broke and the light spilled gold across the creek, he swore he could feel her near, a faint laughter on the wind, a warmth on his shoulder, the echo of her words. Love isn't about holding on, it's about giving. He would close his eyes, breathe deep, and whisper back, "Then I give it still." The forest heard. The world listened. And in that wild, sacred silence, two souls, one of earth, one of spirit, remained bound together beyond time. The cabin endured. The promise lived on, and love, as it always does, became eternal.